Owning a pet snake has long been a source of fascination and unease, with many instinctually quivering at the very sight of them. This fear, however, is not random, but is embedded in our biology. Several studies suggest that snakes were one of the very first major predators of early mammals, which included our distant ancestors. It is because of this that our brains develop systems to detect them quickly and respond with fear, a very real instinct to keep us alive. One way that this has been shown is through neuroscience research, with studies finding that the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for processing fear, responds notably faster to images of snakes than it does to other potential harmful animals. Interestingly, they have even found that infants as young as 6 months old show heightened attention to snake shapes and patterns, suggesting that the sensitivity around these creatures is somewhat embedded within us and not purely a learned fear. My name is Luke Mordew, and this urban legend is the pet snake. In stories for thousands of years, snakes have been associated with villainous intentions, representing sin and darkness in several belief systems. From a psychological point of view, there is the fact that these strange creatures are so different from us in so many ways. It is difficult to find familiar comforts in silent, slithering beings with wide, slitted eyes and an incredible ability to hunt. That being said, there is also an undeniable beauty to them, one that evokes a fascination in many greatly due to their connection to these darker elements. That being said, there is an undeniable beauty about them, and there is an undoubtable fascination with them due to these darker elements. They are consistently used in narratives to this very day, often found in symbols, artwork, and even a turn of phrase. It is due to these several factors that some have found themselves enchanted by these incredible animals. They are remarkable beings that are demonized in cultures worldwide. Perhaps this is why pet owners themselves tend to be the types that do not fit neatly into society. I myself have always found myself drawn to nocturnal animals who are so often dismissed as creepy or associated with horror. With all this in mind, it makes sense why to many, the presence of this deadly creature in a home is considered so unnatural, and perhaps even sinister, an element that is projected onto both the owner and the animal itself. It is this stigma that has fueled countless urban legends regarding snakes, with those who see snake owners as weird or foolish, seeing the tail as a sign of the owner's stupidity and strangeness. Often, this is also combined with a consistent misunderstanding of which snakes are dangerous and which are harmless. In the end, the snake's consistency in narrative shines a light on the obvious societal tension between fascination and fear, consistently feeding it and allowing it to slowly digest within. In my telling of the pet snake, whose big move to the city has finally caught up with her. Jessie's eyes shot open as she simultaneously lifted her head, confused in her sudden snap back to reality. She took a deep breath and rubbed her eyes, gathering her bearings as she accepted that she must have fallen asleep. The television ahead was still on, the DVD's main menu now playing on repeat. She must have only gotten a few minutes in before dozing off, allowing the horror film to play to itself. Perhaps this is why she kept having nightmares, although she was never going to stop watching them. She flicked the TV off and dropped the remote on the coffee table before jumping to her feet. peering back at the glass tank behind her. "Are you still not eating?" she asked in a gentle, concerned voice as she stepped closer towards it, already smiling at the large boa constrictor that rested within, its wide eyes studying her as she approached. Since she had gotten him, he had grown to be a powerfully large and thick specimen, often intimidating any guests that may arrive. Jessie would often play it down, telling them there's nothing to worry about. Although deep down, she took some twisted pleasure in how nervous people were. Resident Zeno was its name, representing two of her favorite horror movie franchises. She didn't know why, but she felt it suited him, even though he was quite clearly a strong blend of browns, oranges, and yellows. Freshly single and in a new city, Jessie was glad to have her not-so-little guy with her. In a way, it made her feel safer, less alone. She arrived at its tank, noticing the dead mouse had now defrosted, still sitting at the bottom. She had spent over an hour in the evening dangling the frozen creature in front of Resident Zeno, but the entire time, he just sat there watching. Strangely, he took no notice of the mouse at all, instead keeping its sharp eyes completely fixated on her as she attempted to entice him to eat. This had been a consistent theme for a couple of days now, and she was growing concerned. He hadn't been himself all week. She always considered him quite lively, but now he was just sitting motionless and calm, as if waiting for something she couldn't quite figure out. He seemed fine when she moved, but perhaps it just took a little longer for its stress to show. With a sigh, she reached out and lifted the slab of wood from the top of the tank. It wasn't the most secure way of keeping input, but that's what you get for buying it cheap, second-hand, and with a broken lid. The snake watched her as she reached inside, scooped up the mouse, and dropped it into a plastic bag on the floor. She softly smiled as she peered down at her slithery friend, a concern clear in her eyes. "You're okay, aren't you, boy?" She pulled away, swallowing her concerns with a sigh, sliding the wooden slab back onto the tank. "Good night, big man," she whispered, flicking off the living room lights, dropping the room into darkness. By the time Jessie had showered, brushed her teeth, and gotten into bed, she'd felt the tiredness creep back up to her. And within a few minutes of her laying down, she had promptly fell asleep. Although it was as she peacefully slumbered that stirring had begun elsewhere in the flat. In the living room, amongst the darkness, the wooden slab had begun to twist and turn, until eventually it lifted from the tank's edges. From inside, Resident Zeno's eyes peeked out into the living room, the strong muscles of its body holding the wood up as it slithered its way over the edge. Slowly, it hit the floor, moving forward with intent, completely ignoring the now decaying mouse that rested in the bag beside him. Once its full body left the tank, it slammed to the ground with a thud, harmonizing with the clang of wood against the glass as the makeshift lid fell back into place. On any other night, this would have instantly woken Jessie. She'd never been much of a heavy sleeper, but with the month she had had, her sleeping pattern had warped, and now she found herself struggling to stay awake. Usually, the slightest of noises would have been enough for her to shoot up alert, but tonight, as her bedroom door creaked open, she remained once again deep in a nightmare. The room was dark, so she wouldn't have seen much anyway. But if she had listened carefully, she would have heard the subtle sound of a body moving across the carpet, edging closer by the second. She would have felt as the duvet began to pull, and soon enough, she would have felt the weight of something else joining her on her bed. It wasn't long before Jessie awoke in a cold sweat, horrified by the nightmare she was having. She controlled her breathing and rubbed the sweat from her forehead before reaching out to the bedside table beside her, swinging back the now lukewarm water inside its glass. Already she was feeling better as she slumped back into her pillow to go back to sleep. It was only now that she finally noticed that she was no longer alone in the bed. She yelped in fright, simultaneously jumping to her feet and flicking on the bedside lamp. In the middle of the bed, lying completely straight like a thick orange stick, was resident Zeno. "What the f?" she whispered under her breath, clinging her chest as she tried to calm her racing heart. Once she had settled herself, she edged closer, sitting on the bed beside it so she could run her fingers down its back. "What are you doing here?" she gently asked, studying its eyes that watched her every move. She laughed to herself and scooped him up in her arms, carrying him back into the living room. With a fair bit of struggle, she managed to get the lid open and the large, heavy snake back inside without hurting either herself or her snake. Although, she was now both wide awake and even more tired than before due to it. She crouched down to keep herself at eye level with the curious creature and studied it once again, unsure of what it was doing. Perhaps it was lonely, she thought to herself. Maybe it wanted a cuddle. Whatever it was doing, this was the final straw for her. Something wasn't right, and she needed to get him looked at. The following morning, she was sitting in the vet's waiting area, watching the nervous faces of the several exotic pet owners who impatiently waited for their appointments. She began guessing what animals they would have in their containers. She adored all weird and wonderful animals, but didn't want to creep any of them out. She did, however, manage to strike up a conversation with an elderly woman beside her. She had a chameleon with her, resting inside a transparent plastic box perched on a stick, with resident Zeno requiring a far larger container, one that was becoming harder and harder to transport each year. He didn't seem to mind though, simply perched in its container on the floor between her feet. "Jessie and resident..." "What's that?" a woman asked as she entered the waiting room, trying to read the name off the clipboard in her hand. Zeno," Jessie happily replied whilst getting to her feet, pulling the container up with both hands. The woman stepped forward to help, escorting them both into the vet's offices in the back. Once inside, they placed the snake on the table and shared the usual pleasantries as she waited for the vet to arrive. Luckily, this didn't take too long before she entered, already moving at pace, clearly in the midst of a very busy day. Hello, she said to each of them as she walked by, pausing at the snake as she leaned down to watch him. "And hello, big guy," she said with an extra layer of excitement and joy at the very sight of its beautiful patterns. She stood up straight, slipping on her rubber gloves as she prepared herself to open the container. "So you say he's just not been eating?" she asked as she unhooked the container lid, ready to reach inside and grab the snake. "Yeah," Jessie replied. "He's just not been himself lately." The vet nodded. As she pulled the snake from its container and placed it on the table, it instantly began to uncoil, ensuring that he could see Jessie in front of him with more movement than she had seen in some time. "He hasn't eaten, he doesn't move much, and now he's trying to be an escape artist too," Jessie added, trying to be helpful as she furthered the context. The vet, only half listening as she studied resident Zeno's body, suddenly perked up. What do you mean?" "Last night, I woke up to find him laying on the bed beside me." At this point, the atmosphere in the room tensed, as both the vet and her assistant froze. "How so?" the vet asked, now slowly rising to her feet, studying the snake that still studied every move Jessie made. Jessie laughed, growing increasingly nervous about what the vet was about to say, instantly worried something was seriously wrong. "He was lying straight like he wanted a cuddle." Quickly, her smile faded as she watched the nervous horror grow on the vet's face. "Okay," the vet said as she slowly lifted the snake, being extra cautious with every motion she made. "Don't make any sudden movements," she added, growing increasingly frightened as she slowly edged the snake back into its container. "So what's going on?" Jessie asked, now panicked by the strange behavior of the staff. Once the snake had been placed inside its container and the lid had clicked shut, the vets let out a sigh of relief, although the tense atmosphere in the room remained. Jessie, confused, turned to resident Zeno with concern, only to find that once again, its sharp eyes were staring at her through the glass, fixated. Before, she had assumed this was a look of love and adoration. Although now, she was beginning to question whether it was something else. "You're very lucky to still be here," the vet said with a deep exhale. "He wasn't in your bed for a hug. He was measuring whether he could fit you inside of him. He was gonna eat you whole." The story of the pet snake continues to be shared to this very day, an urban legend that is still very much at work within the rumor mill. It was one that I was told several times growing up. In fact, it was less than 2 years ago that somebody told me the tale as if it was a true story, claiming it happened to a friend of her cousin. As I was at work and the story was being told in a room full of people, I didn't want to embarrass her, so I said nothing, although I did find it fascinating how many people around us instantly believed it without hesitation. I watched as several of them shuddered at the idea, horrified by the very notion it could happen to them. It is not only the snake aspect that seemingly rattles people, but also the perceived deception involved. The story itself subverts the concept of pet ownership, revealing a supposedly domesticated animal as the calculating predator that it truly is. There is a dash of anxiety that it triggers in those that hear it. Whether they have a pet snake, dog, or cat, we're reminded that although we think we understand our animals inside and out, ultimately, they are a completely different species to us, and we will never truly fully understand their minds. Above that are the general anxieties around betrayal and how often we may misunderstand someone's seemingly innocent actions when in reality they mean to hurt us. Then there's the logical aspect of the argument it brings forward, with talks of the stupidity and even immorality of keeping exotic animals as pets. The story enforces not only that it is dangerous to keep a snake as a pet within a home, but also that it's unfair to the animal. To them, a home is not a natural place for a snake, and with its natural instincts, it is in the wild that it should be. The story itself has been around for a few decades at least, appearing sometime before the 1990s, although, unfortunately, the exact date has been lost amongst history. By the early 90s, the story was already being circulated through word of mouth and had been doing so for some time. I remember hearing the story in my childhood in the late 90s or early 2000s, likely further pushed by the horrors triggered within audiences after seeing 1997's Hollywood film Anaconda. This film evolved snakes from scary creatures to horrifying monsters. With its overuse of exaggeration and the bending of scientific fact, the film somewhat warped the concept of snakes within a whole new generation. Anacondas are big, but they're not that big. By 2008, the pet snake urban legend had become so widespread that it was now being discussed in books and covered in myth-bunking websites such as Snopes. Although, even here, where the story first came from has seemingly never been known, although it is considered a fairly new folkloric tale, consistently being spread to this very day. The protagonist of the story is always a woman that owns a large constrictor snake. The type can vary, but more often than not, it is considered to be a python or a boa constrictor. Interestingly, there's nothing about the story that suggests the gender of the protagonist would make any great difference to the tale. And yet, throughout its many retellings, the gender never changes. Scholars suggest the specificity of the gender is in place due to the consistent cultural assumptions around female pet owners. The vulnerability of the feminine main character at its top level emphasizes the danger, as women tend to be naturally smaller and physically weaker than biological men. However, it also makes it more believable to many due to the stereotypes of particularly white women, assuming every animal in the world is going to be friendly and approachable. At its core, it's just another legend that places a woman as the lead due to their association with empathy and emotion, which are sometimes used, such as in this story, as synonymous with ignorance and naivety. In almost every iteration, the woman allows the snake to spread out in her bed beside her, assuming that it is essentially giving her a cuddle. It is her naivety that limits her much-needed concern, and if it was not for the vet, she would have likely been eaten alive due to that sweet but silly thought process. At its core, this is a tale that plays on the varying levels of fear that a significant number of people feel. In fact, general statistics suggest that over 50% of people report that, at the very least, they feel fear or discomfort around snakes, whilst 1 in 3 adults worldwide are said to have moderate to severe fears of snakes. Although if you were to limit these stats to the US alone, something curious happens. As here, estimates suggest that up to 30% of its citizens not only fear snakes, but hold a clinically significant phobia of snakes, known as ophidiophobia. When it comes to the stories like that of the pet snake, audiences tend to find themselves horrified by the very notion of it. Although, interestingly, if we're honest with ourselves, the same audience, no matter how horrified, would likely feel a dash of disappointment on discovering it was not a true story. It is likely due to this, mixed in with the general ignorance many of us have towards snakes, that have also helped it slither along the zeitgeist as it feeds on our fears. We don't fact-check it, as we know snakes are dangerous, and frankly, we like a good, scary story. Although, is there actually any truth to it? Bluntly put, not really, no. Firstly, constrictors have never been known to ever size up or measure their prey in any way before attempting to consume them. This hasn't been observed at all, whether in the wild or in captivity. In fact, their technique is far less calculated. Instead, they'll just begin trying to swallow their prey and figure out whether it's possible whilst already giving it a go. There would need to be a significant level of cognition happening for a snake to first choose its prey, then measure itself up and contemplate it. There is also the factor that snakes do not plan their meals. If they come across something that they think they can swallow, they will go for it then and there. There is no plotting and save for later thoughts going on inside the serpent's mind. If the snake wanted to eat the woman, it wouldn't have waited for an opportune moment, especially since she was already asleep in bed. And even if that pet snake was going to attempt eating its human, it would find it extremely difficult anyway. We're not good prey for snakes, as we're a very awkward species to swallow whole due to our gangly limbs and long structure. A snake does have the ability to flex open their jaws, and this allows them to swallow food much larger than them. But even so, we have very stiff, broad shoulders that snakes would have a nightmare getting over. It would need to be a very petite human to even fit within the jaws of a snake. One part of the tale that isn't too far-fetched is that a snake may actually come and lay its body down beside you if it was given the chance and felt like doing so. This is still unlikely, but it isn't unheard of. Although it's worth noting that the snake would not be measuring you up and would far more likely be seeking the warmth from your body. Snakes, being cold-blooded, cannot make their own body heat, and so, no matter how many blankets you put them in, they would never get warm this way. They need to absorb heat from a warm source, such as a specialized light bulb in its container, the sun in the wild, and you in your bed. Finally, there is the fasting element of the tale. Now, snakes have been known to refuse to eat whilst in captivity. However, once again, this is due to completely different factors. A snake refusing to eat is more likely to be due to seasonal changes, illness, and stress. There is no evolutionary reason for a snake to pass up on a meal just in case a bigger meal was to come. That's just not how they work. Who's to say when that next meal could be? Or if something else could swoop in and take it away before the snake had a chance? A hungry animal eats, after all. So whether you're glad to hear it or not, there is no part of this story that is true. And science disproves almost every element of it. Not to mention the fact that, although it has happened to millions of friends of a friend, there has never been a legitimate story put forward of such an encounter. That being said, snakes are still very dangerous animals out in the wild, and ones we rightly have evolved to be cautious of. Although, when we consider the reasoning behind that evolution, we have to consider, is it just their venom we need to be wary of? Or is there any possibility that we could, somehow, become their prey? If you're still listening, I know you share my passion for folklore and urban legends. But to keep these stories coming, I need your help. For just £3 a month, you can ensure the show thrives, with shorter breaks between seasons and even more content created. As a Patreon subscriber, you'll unlock exclusive perks, including access to our bonus series, Modern Myths, giving you 8 additional episodes each season, featuring captivating tales such as The Hodag, The Dark Watchers, and many more. You'll also enjoy behind-the-scenes insights, discounts on merchandise, and access to our private community chat, where you can connect directly with me and other urban legend enthusiasts. And as an extra thank you, I randomly feature patrons in upcoming stories, so you could become part of the legends we discuss. Your support isn't just subscribing, it's joining a passionate community dedicated to keeping folklore alive. Your contribution directly fuels the research and production of this show. If you're ready to join, just click the Patreon link in our show notes to subscribe, and I'll see you there. But for now, back to the legend. There may not be any documented accounts of a pet snake plotting to eat its owner, although I'm sure it will not surprise you to learn that there are several documented accounts regarding deadly encounters with snakes in other ways. In October 1996, a 19-year-old boy by the name of Grant Williams was found unconscious in the hallway of his New York building by a neighbor. Tightly wrapped around him was his 13-foot pet Burmese python, whom he had named Damien. He and his 17-year-old brother Lamar had purchased the snake around 5 months prior for $300 and were keeping it, along with several other snakes, in their Bronx apartment. Emergency responders quickly arrived and managed to get the snake off of him before quickly taking him to the local medical center. However, he was pronounced dead shortly after his arrival. Investigations into how this could have happened revealed that Grant had begun preparing to feed Damien a live chicken, which was still sitting nearby in its box. The general consensus was that the presence of the chicken, alongside its scent, likely triggered the snake's feeding instincts, leading it to mistake Grant for prey. 10 years later, in September 2006, a 23-year-old resident of Lanesville, Indiana, named Patrick Von Ullman, found himself in a similar bind, being contracted by his 14-foot, 100-pound reticulated python. Patrick was known as an experienced reptile enthusiast who owned 15 snakes and loved them all dearly. He entered his backyard shed to treat the python for a condition known as mouth rot, a bacterial infection common in snakes. However, after he didn't return for several hours, a family member went to check on what was going on. They entered to find him unresponsive, with the python sitting nearby. Later, an autopsy would confirm that Patrick had died from asphyxiation due to the compression of the neck and chest. 2 years later, a similar incident occurred. However, rather than a personal pet, this took place in a zoo. It was in the August of 2008 that 29-year-old biology student Eric Arrieta broke protocol by opening a 10-foot python's enclosure during a night shift at the General Francisco de Miranda Park Zoo in Caracas, Venezuela. By the time Eric was found by colleagues, the snake was already attempting to swallow his head, indicating that he had been bitten and constricted before the python began its ingestion process. 2 months after this, in October 2008, 25-year-old Amanda Ruth Black was trying to administer medication to her 13-foot reticulated python in her home in Virginia, USA. Her husband would later come home to find his wife's body in front of the snake's open enclosure, with the agitated python nearby. In fact, it was said that it was so agitated that it required 2 police officers to restrain it. The following year, an event occurs that takes things beyond the typical snake attack, venturing far darker and far more horrifying. It was just an average Florida night in July 2009 when an 8-foot, 6-inch albino python escaped its enclosure, which was ridiculously secured with nothing but a quilt and some safety pins. The snake slithered through the dark until it found itself at the crib of a 2-year-old Cheyenne hare. Whilst this was happening, her mother, Jaren Hare, and her mother's boyfriend, Charles Darnell, rested nearby, completely unaware of what was happening. Eventually, Charles discovered the snake already wrapped around the little girl and dove forward to intervene, but by then, it was far too late. Unfortunately, though, this is not where the darkness of this tale ends. Investigations into the events revealed that not only was the snake enclosure subpar, but the snake itself was severely underweight, weighing only 13 pounds instead of the expected 150 pounds for a snake that age, which strongly suggested that the snake was not being properly taken care of. To make matters sickeningly worse, the couple would later admit that the snake had, in fact, already escaped its enclosure multiple times the preceding months, and they had done little to rectify this issue. The salt in the wound was that neither of the couple even possessed the required state permit to legally keep the animal, making this a layer upon layer of malpractice. In July 2011, both Jaron and Charles were convicted of third-degree murder, manslaughter, and child neglect, sentenced to 12 years in prison each, followed by 5 years of probation. In the early hours of August 5, 2013, a tragic incident unfolded in Campbellton, New Brunswick, as brothers Noah and Connor Barth, aged 4 and 6, were fatally asphyxiated by an African rock python during a sleepover at the apartment of their friend's father, Jean-Claude Savoy. The python, approximately 14 feet long and weighing around 100 pounds, escaped from its enclosure in Savoy's apartment, slithering through a ventilation duct, and fell into the living room where the boys were sleeping on a mattress. Autopsies confirmed that both children died from asphyxiation and had multiple puncture wounds consistent with snake bites. Savoy, the owner of the exotic pet store Reptile Ocean located beneath the apartment, was charged with criminal negligence causing death in 2015, with the prosecution arguing that Savoy failed to take appropriate measures to secure the snake and protect the children. During the trial, it was revealed that the snake had previously attempted to escape and that the ventilation system was not adequately secured. However, on November 9th, 2016, a jury found Savoy not guilty of the charges, concluding that the prosecution had not proven beyond a reasonable doubt that his actions constituted criminal negligence. In August 2017, a deadly encounter with a pet python occurred on the shores of the UK for the first time when Dan Brandon, a 31-year-old exotic animal enthusiast, was found dead in his bedroom by his mother. As you may have suspected by now, his 8-foot African rock python was discovered nearby. Interestingly, Dan was found with no external injuries or bite marks, leading coroners to believe that it may very well have been an accidental suffocation. Brandon had raised his snake, who he had ironically named Tiny, from a hatchling, and was said to have a good understanding of her strength, which is why he no longer placed her around his neck. However, it seems, whether intentionally or not, Tiny ended up coiled around Brandon and had squeezed just a little too hard. So far, the stories have shown us how easy it is for these horrifying events to take place and just how vigilant snake owners need to be. Although, in all of these cases, the body of the snake's victim has been found out in the open, not within the snake's stomach. The serpent of our legend was preparing to eat, with experts explaining that it's near impossible for a snake to eat the average person. That fact is true in most circumstances, but, of course, As all things, there are exceptions that prove the rule. It was March 2017 when a 25-year-old palm oil farmer from a remote village in West Sulawesi set out one evening to harvest some crops. His name was Akbar Salabiro and had with him a machete so he could get on with some hard work. Although, after his shift had ended, he never returned home. Soon enough, his neighbors began to worry for his safety and began a search where they came across his boots and machete near the edge of a plantation. However, Akbar himself was nowhere to be seen. That was until they spotted something unusual. A giant 23-foot reticulated python up ahead, although it was thicker than it usually was, with a very wide and full midsection. Fearing the worst, the villagers killed the snake before slitting open its stomach to reveal that Akbar, fully clothed, had been swallowed whole, head first. This was to be one of the very first verified cases of a human being consumed by a python in Indonesia, and, understandably, it triggered a newfound anxiety across the country. It is thought that due to Akbar's small stature and the sheer size of the snake had managed to do what many serpents before it had tried and failed to achieve. The culprit, a reticulated python, is a species known to be the longest snake in the world. Although, even so, attacks on humans have always been extremely rare. This, however, has begun to change in recent years due to extensive deforestation and the expansion of farmlands. As humanity has been cutting deeper into wildlife, our paths with dangerous animals are crossing more often, bringing dangers that we had not needed to consider before. A year later, in the June of 2018, a 54-year-old woman by the name of Watiba went missing after heading out to check her vegetable garden near her village on Muna Island in southeast Sulawesi, Indonesia. The following morning, her family stepped out to find her sandals, flashlight, and machete, although there were no signs of her nearby. This began a search party of over 100 villagers as they banded together to figure out where she had gone. Unfortunately, what they found was an extremely bloated, 23-foot-long reticulated python. Once again, the villagers killed the snake and transported it back into the village, where they cut it open, and inside, they found Watiba's perfectly intact body. These were just a few of the many cases involving death by snakes, and while they still remain rare in the scheme of things, they are tales that snake owners need to consider. The confirmed cases of snake attacks create a strong connection between myth and reality, and it is due to that fact that stories like the pet snake resonate with people so deeply. When something unthinkable happens, even if it's just once, it carves out space for that fear to linger, with just enough room for the legend to grow. Snake ownership is a topic that tends to split people. On one side, you have those that believe keeping snakes as a pet is reckless at best and outright dangerous at worst. An unnatural attempt to domesticate something that will never be tamed. This chapter in itself will likely solidify those beliefs in those who previously thought it. However, it is also worth noting that these potential dangers arise with any pet. I'm a keen animal lover, but we cannot be naive to the fact that they are animals and have instincts that we as pet owners cannot always read or understand. On the other side of the fence, you have those who are passionate snake owners, insistent that their reptiles know and trust them. Some even go as far as to claim their snakes love them, enjoy cuddles, and get lonely when they're away. Here is where things get difficult though, as we do as humans tend to project our own emotions and expectations onto animals, and this overestimation of our understanding is what can inadvertently cause dangerous environments. The idea that our protagonist snake was being affectionate is, in itself, a misunderstanding of animal behavior. Attachment is a trait that is linked to social animals, which is why we find ourselves drawn to other mammals, such as dogs. They experience attachment in a similar way to us. A snake, however, is not a social animal in any way. They are aware of their caretaker and do recognize us, mostly due to our smell. But it is widely understood that this connection is limited. That being said, it is also worth noting that there is research into snakes ongoing, and like much of the world, our understanding is consistently growing with it. Some of that research has even been showing promise that snakes may very well be far more developed than previously thought. It's not just a pet snake legend either. There are several tales out there that correlate with this urban legend in one way or another. One commonly shared is the story of somebody finding a snake in a bunch of bananas whilst browsing a shop. The story usually ends by a customer panicked and shocked by the sudden sight, eventually being bitten amongst the frantic nature of it all. This story is notably older than the pet snake, first doing the rounds in the US in the 1960s. Although there's an evolution of this legend out there too, telling the story of somebody buying a houseplant, usually a cactus, and taking it home. After a few days, the plant begins to move and shift until finally, hundreds of tiny, venomous spiders hatch and spill out. Like the snake in the store tale it evolved from, it plays on that fear of something dangerous hiding in something totally normal. And again, while there are occasional real cases of insects hiding a ride in plants, the more extreme versions are almost always nothing but urban legends. These stories stick in people's minds as they tap into a similar fear, the very real dangers of our world popping up where they otherwise shouldn't be. Both that story and the pet snake elevate the serpent from an animal to a threat waiting to strike. Maybe that is why these stories continue to spread. The story of a monster that exists within our very real world. In the end, it doesn't matter if the stories are true. What matters is that they could be true. They linger in that space between logic and fear, where the things we love may turn against us. It reminds us that as we drop our guard and go about our everyday life, we have no idea what is being plotted against us. In the end, it's clear that what keeps this particular story going isn't necessarily the fact that it's a snake. It's more about how little we truly know of the intentions of those around us and what we deem trustworthy.
Urban Legends is researched, written and produced by Luke Morgie. Co-edited by Sophie Tickle. Music by Billy Japp. With additional sounds from Storyblocks and Envato. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please like and review our show on your chosen podcast provider. This simple task is a big part of our show's continuation and growth. To access more chapters through our bonus material, early releases, ad-free content and more, become a patron by clicking the link in our show notes. To follow us on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube, simply search Urban Legends Folklore or visit lukemordew.com/podcast. If you have more information or a correction on anything said, email us on luke@lukemordew.com. We aim to ensure that all information provided is accurate and up to date, and this remains a top priority.